Hello and welcome to or welcome back to Sharp Scratch. This is a podcast brought to you by the BMJ, where medical students, resident doctors and expert guests come together to discuss things that we think are really important to know in medical school but might not get taught on the curriculum. I'm your host, Zaynah Khan, a medical student in London, and this year the editorial scholar running BMJ student. We've got a fantastic panel with us today, including Elgan, Maira, Khadijah. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Khadijah and I am a fifth year medical student studying at Leicester Medical School. I intercalated last year in medical humanities, philosophy and law at Imperial. So essentially I did the same course as Zaynah. And we also did the creative writing module, which we'll talk about, I imagine, in more detail.
Now, can I pass over to you, Elgan?
Of course, yeah. I'm Elgan. I'm a fifth year medical student up in Scotland, in Edinburgh. And I was one of the Clarke scholars for the BMJ this year. And that's where, I suppose, my interest in writing has blossomed.
Thank you. And finally, to Maira, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. So I'm Maira. I'm a third year medical student at St Andrews. And I'm also a freelance journalist, so when I'm away from medical school and I have time, I do a bit of writing.
And finally, I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Gita Ralleigh. We're so excited to have you today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Zaynah. So yeah, I'm an ex-doctor, I suppose, but I worked in the NHS for over 30 years. And alongside that, I'm also a writer and a poet with 4 published books. And I'm also a lecturer in creative writing at Imperial College. And both Zaynah and Khadijah were in my class last year, which is fantastic.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to have you all today, and I'm really excited for this episode. This is actually my first episode, and I thought it was quite a fitting theme to start with. When I was thinking of the themes of the episodes, I was thinking about what I'm doing now, and how it combines both medicine and creativity. But I did have that kind of dilemma of feeling like I'd have to sacrifice my creativity in order to go to medical school. But as Khadijah said, intercalating in medical humanities and then getting involved in creative writing with Gita and in other ways, it felt like I was able to bring that back and like marry the two things together. And I thought this would be a really interesting conversation between all of us to kind of talk about our experiences of bringing the two together. So I guess my first question then is for the panel. Medicine is often seen as a very STEM-focused career. So what's it like navigating medical school while also having a creative passion or interest in writing, as we all do?
Yeah, sure. So to begin with, I thought it was quite tough. Any writing that I do in medicine often feels quite lackluster, quite repetitive. So I think there is like a tendency just to emulate the senior by sort of mirroring their language. And that's quite natural, especially when you're, trying to sort of progress. But it did feel, or it just generally does feel more like mimicry than experimental writing. So I always had this nagging sense of, well, I want to reclaim my own experimental way of writing. And because of time constraints, I sort of started off with poetry because I thought that was more achievable to ease me into the writing. It's quick, it's snappy, and because I have quite a visual memory, anything that I saw in placement was heavily imbued with these metaphors and sort of underlying meaning. So I thought that those ideas lent themselves quite well to poetry. And then I wanted to branch out a little bit, write longer reflections, and that's when I sort of coerce myself, if you like, into writing a newsletter called Dislocated, and it's a medical humanities newsletter at my medical school. And I convinced myself that I was just writing for myself. And then when I felt a bit more comfortable, I released it. And then I just suppose one thing led to another, and I released, issue after issue. And I suppose I can say the rest is history.
Thank you. I do really need to check out that newsletter.
You do.
What about Elgan and Maira? Do you have any similar experiences or maybe something different in what you found?
I've personally found that medicine, I feel like, as a degree, gives you so little opportunity to write that I didn't even consider it for quite a long time. I think in my entire medical degree to date, I've written 2 essays, which have been both academically focused. They're both my first year. After that, we basically don't do any writing at all. And I think it took quite a while in uni for me to find, if you like, role models. I suppose that's why it's so interesting to hear from Gita today, because there are medical writing role models. You can sort of find them in the news, you can find them on book covers, but actually in medical school, it feels like there's almost none. It took quite a while for me to find people who are interested in writing, but I eventually discovered that there's things called student newspapers. Suddenly you discover there's tens and tens of people whose primary interest outside of their degree is writing, and suddenly the world opens up, I think.
Yeah, I think that I really agree with that, with the world opening up. What about you, Maira? How have you found your experience of balancing these two things?
I think it's quite interesting hearing how teaching varies from medical school to medical school. Because at St Andrews, I think we're quite different. And there is quite, I think from first year, there's always been quite a big emphasis on reflective writing. And after every placement, we have a minimum amount of reflections that we're encouraged that we have to write. And, even through our communication workshops and there is a lot of focus and emphasis on how we're speaking to the patient. I think in that kind of way, for me, it feels like it does kind of tie into writing a little bit and kind of the process that you go through. So I think for me, I've kind of felt, and I've had a few opportunities in medical school as well, to be able to write. So I think it's, but initially it is something that when I first entered medicine, I didn't think I'd have the opportunity to do, because it does feel very kind of far removed.
Yeah, I see that too. I think at my medical school at King's, I've also had a few opportunities to write creatively. My SSC in year 2 and year 3 are both in medical humanities. So my essays that I submitted in the end were quite literature focused, which I really enjoyed. But touching back on what Elgan was saying in terms of finding role models in medicine, I definitely see that too, Gita, in finding your journey really inspirational and how you've managed to balance both things, and then deciding on pursuing the creativity in the end. Could you talk us through that journey a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting to hear all of your varying experiences because, as Elgan was saying, I really didn't have much opportunity to write during medical school or even as a junior doctor. I mean, I wrote academic papers, for example, but it wasn't really creative writing. And I really, really wish that had been different because there are still moments and experiences and kind of interactions with patients that stick in my memory years and years and years later after I finished training. And I wish I'd had the language to allow me to kind of express something of that creatively while I was there. So one of the things I'm really passionate about is the work that I do at Imperial with scientists and medical students, showing that it doesn't have to be either or. You can do both. And I did do both for quite a long time. So for 12 years or so, I was working as a consultant. I came to writing really, really late in my medical career, but I was working as a consultant 3 days a week in the NHS. I was teaching at Imperial 1 day a week, and I was doing my own writing on the 4th day a week. So I think when I did finally choose to pursue only creative work, it didn't feel as big of a jump as I'd imagined because I'd been doing both for so long.
But I was wondering for you, because I know you did transition, but in terms of now referring to yourself as an ex-doctor, when I was applying for medical school, I don't know if it's the same for the panel, my teachers at Sixth were more only apply for medicine if you know that it's your calling. Medicine is not a subject to study or a job, it is a calling. And it feels almost like an identity, like a label that's put on you. Did you feel like it affected how you view yourself or maybe how people see you? How did you find that kind of emotional aspect of shifting?
Well, yeah, I mean, financially, it's not great. But I think because I have this contact, and so I've done teaching outside of Imperial as well. I ran a poetry module for medical students at Southampton last year. I think because I have this contact with medical students and with the medical school, that helps to keep me kind of involved. I'm also very passionate about arts for health and well-being. And I feel that lots of the work I do, even in schools, really, really aligns to so many of our worries about mental health in young people, even mental health for students at Imperial. So I feel like because there's so much focus now on the possibilities of creativity and the arts for improving our health and well-being, I can kind of shift myself into something that's a little bit in between, that's not just writing. I haven't completely left the therapeutic side of my practice behind. Can I just add
Yeah.
to that and say that I completely agree, and that I feel in the modern era, the emphasis of sort of being a doctor is a vocation, is like, it's just so prevalent and emphasized. But I do find that there is also room for recognizing that the arts and the humanities play, an equally important aspect of, like Gita says, of promoting health and well-being. That's also very, very important. It's not simply about like administering drugs and like performing surgeries on patients. It's thinking more holistically.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that in terms of when we view medicine now, or we talk about it in a very paternalistic way, but that kind of holistic aspect is so important. And then even looking at places like Bethlehem, the hospital, and other kind of health institutions where there is patient-made art that's celebrated and encouraged. And I think it's so important in terms of like overall healing and just feeling like it's personalized, like you are a human that is being cared for rather than like a patient number that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that if anybody doesn't know the work of Dr. Daisy Fancourt at UCL, there's actually an increasing evidence base now looking at the actual practical uses of arts and creativity in kind of tangible things like reduction in blood pressure, reduction in symptoms of depression and anxiety that can be measured. So it's not just a kind of nice add-on. I do think it's a fundamental part of medical training now, for sure.
I wanted to ask for the panel members online, do you find that medical humanities, I guess it varies between your schools, but do you feel like it's a part of your system?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have a lot of, and I'm not sure if this is the same case for you, Elgan and Khadijah, and we have, I guess, a side that looks at kind of like the social context a lot of the time for patients. Again, looking at it holistically, because kind of trying to understand that when a patient comes into clinic and they're presenting with a disease, it's not just the mechanism of the disease, it's not just the anatomy that you have to look at. There's a whole host of social, emotional, psychological factors. And looking at things like a big topic that we look at is equity versus equality. Again, based on different demographics and discrimination, etc., things like that. Some populations will need that extra support and will need more support compared to somebody who's more privileged, perhaps. And kind of looking at it from that perspective. And then we have the opportunity next semester to do a dissertation and get a BSc. And that can be in any sort of topic. So I'm quite interested in public health medicine, but I've not decided what topic I want to do for my dissertation yet. I'm thinking about it. So I think that there is a bit more scope and room for creativity in that aspect, I think.
I think something that we touched on earlier was how there is room for being creative in medical school, but it's often not in the curriculum necessarily. Something that I found in medicine is even though the act of like diagnosing and like getting to know a patient or getting to understand what's going on is very creative and how you problem solve that and help them, as a student in my clinical years, I found it very repetitive. I think I feel like I go to placement and I really enjoy my the patient facing aspects of it, but there's so much that's like, okay, now I'm gonna go back to the common room and do like 100 questions on QuesMed or PassMed, which I could never do, but all my clinical partners would be racing through them, and they had really good pattern recognition and they'd pick up on these things that I just felt like my brain doesn't work like that. I found it quite boring, to be honest. And I was like, I came excited working to get into medical school, not to just be doing questions on an online question bank. So it feels like often, even though our job is creative and you have to problem solve, we're taught to just memorize and regurgitate information. But yeah, so it's almost like medicine is inherently creative, but we're taught in a very specific way that's quite formulaic. I was wondering how writing might help us to shift this perspective. And I was wondering, Gita, whether you found any experience with that.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my things when I try and sell creativity and creative writing to the powers that be at the university is that it's a tool, and critical thinking is something that really all scientists, but medics particularly, really, really need. Narrative medicine and the health humanities or medical humanities generally try to bridge this sort of gap it's an epistemological gap, it's a gap in knowledge, but it's also a gap in language, between the language that health professionals use, which is, as you say, formulaic, scripted, sometimes overly technical, and the language used by a patient, which can be very stilted, fragmented. It's difficult to express your pain, your fear, your anxieties around your condition. Sometimes you feel you're being silenced. Sometimes you feel a lot of shame around talking about these things. So the health humanities can help us look at both perspectives. It's a way of looking at the interiority of a person beyond the role that we play, the role of being a doctor or a medical student or a patient. It's a way of connecting our inner selves, these hopes, dreams that we have, these fears, these griefs, all the kind of messy and beautiful parts of our existence, which actually are what makes us all human and transcend all the differences between us. So that's why I'm so evangelical about writing as a tool.
I really love that, and I think I resonate with that in terms of like connecting to your inner self and holding the hopes and dreams. I really love that.
How receptive are medical students to that, like, perspective on writing when you first start teaching them? Sort of scale of 1 to 10.
Yeah, well, I have a very select group. I'm lucky, but I also do teach a big group of biomedicine students, and they don't get a choice. They are just stuck with me, so they've not chosen to do creative writing. And what I do is I just break it down, and we start off very simply. I have a really a tiny exercise where we take a photo from our phone, because we're always taking pictures of a tree or whatever, and we write haiku. And we use it as a reflective practice, really, as a kind of form of a diary or a journal. And I love that, because when you're really busy, you're on a train or a bus, you've got your phone and you can take a picture and you can write, a haiku. It's only, a very short amount of syllables and words, and anyone can do it. And if you think about it just as a kind of daily practice or a reflective practice, and don't think, oh, it's got to be brilliant, it's got to be good poetry, or it's got to be, then I think you overcome your fear of it. And then people are more receptive than they would be if I said to them, oh, you have to write a poem that's worthy of being published in a magazine, or a poem that you can, stand up and read to the whole class. Thinking about it as an internal reflection of you talking to yourself, really, is a really nice way to frame it, so that even if people are a little bit embarrassed or a little bit shy about creative work, that makes them realize that it's just a form of diarizing or journaling as well.
I think something that I found as well in the creative writing course we did, it almost feels like connecting with your inner child in a way, like what you were saying about how do I get like a good grade in this, or how do I reach the mark scheme. When you kind of take that away from STEM students, you're kind of like connecting with a younger version of yourself, where you're just creating something for fun.
I was just going to say, which is very unusual for medicine, because it's always been about targets and goals and percentiles. So I would imagine like it's extremely liberating for medical students to be able to connect creatively without fear of judgment, without aspiring to anything.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you think about a child, they're messing around with paint, they're playing with sand and water, trying to build a sandcastle, they're doing role play with their toys. So art, storytelling, science, experimentation, all of those are linked for a young child. It's only as we get older and these kind of barriers and boundaries go up that we sort of think, oh, I'm not good at that. I can't do art. I can't write a story. I'm not creative. But actually, we all have that potential. I really feel that very strongly.
100%. And I also I don't think it's so far removed from medicine. I don't think it's like us taking a step back from medicine, doing something entirely different. When you're talking to patients on the ward, it's not that patient X is going to fit the entire criteria of all the questions you've done on question banks. There's something so particular and individual in their story, and you need to be able to connect with them and figure that out and get to know them and find something that works specifically for them. But I think creative writing helps to kind of break down in your head and be able to make those connections and form those connections too. Where do you think creativity fits in day-to-day practice of medicine?
Well, I think it's really important to hold on to the fact that, we are not treating bodies or machines or systems. We're treating human beings, and we need to be able to see those human beings in their wholeness. And creativity is such a fundamental part of being human, that I think it helps you with all sorts of things. you need to be able to imagine to create empathy within yourself for a patient. And as we know, and we know this because in the States, they've actually looked at this and broken down that if a patient doesn't feel they're being listened to, they're being heard, that the doctor is empathic, they're far more likely to sue the doctor and the hospital. And empathy is such a fundamental part of that interaction. And if you don't have imagination, if you can't put yourself in someone else's position, how are you going to empathize with them? So I think that's one really big way. But I'd love to hear what you guys think as well.
I think you've all touched on some really interesting points there, because I agree that as medical students, we just get really hooked on the metrics. But one of the things that my lecturers and teachers, they always tell me is that, you guys are really focused on all this technical stuff, but medicine actually it's an art. It's something that, it's not something that you can just pin down to the learning objectives in the curriculum. And I think that even, in one of my clinical skill sessions, one of the things that we were looking at is when you're examining patients, like sometimes, there's white coat syndrome. So like, they're very aware of being monitored, and sometimes you need to approach them like, a friendly, regular person, and they don't feel like they're being kind of examined in that sense. And the way that I think that it kind of links to journalism and creativity and creative writing is that, so one of the things I was doing recently was like a feature, and I was like going and interviewing people, like cold approaching people on the street and reporting and doing that in the summer holidays for a newspaper. And initially it was really, really scary, but it's so much of that links to medicine, because you need to be able to build a rapport. You need to be able to get them to open up to you. They don't know who you are, you know what you want. They're scared. So it's about kind of being able to listen to them and not always talking over them and kind of giving the impression that you know it all. And I think it's being able to hear their story. And I think those same principles actually apply to medicine so much. But we kind of just get stuck on the science and don't realize actually it's, a human being that is in front of us, and they've got so much to tell you if you let them speak.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that's what makes medicine in practice so powerful. Khadijah, Elgan, do you have anything to add?
Maybe this is not exactly so much writing, but it's something I've done as a result of writing. And I suppose everybody does within creative writing is talk to other people and interview other people or research sources and try and gather information about their writing. And I think that overlaps so strongly with medicine. It's almost exactly the same task, isn't it, really? If you interview somebody, try and understand everything you want to know if you're writing an article about them or if you're trying to gather information. It's essentially the same as having a conversation with a patient. And the task you're doing as a writer when you're doing that is you're trying to understand what their story is, trying to pick up the bits they haven't, so the information they haven't given you, and then plan how you're going to sort of synthesize that story. I've literally just described a patient consultation, haven't I, essentially? So I feel like the skill set is almost identical. I definitely think that me having interviewed people in a journalistic sense, which is my most recent experience of it, has just made me better at talking to patients without imposing a structure of a patient consultation over it and just letting people talk.
I would echo everything that Elgan said about the sort of problem solving, the detective work, if you like. And I do appreciate that when something's less clear cut in medicine, the problem solving that's required is in essence a construction of a narrative or a story. So you've got, of course, the patient's story that's relayed by their history, which must be interpreted along with, examination findings, investigation findings, and then it becomes a process of selecting relevant details and then assembling a timeline of events, which then produces a sort of cascade of cause and effect. So, I don't know, A and B led to C and C and D led to E. And that leads you to some kind of understanding. The way I think of it is it's like you're convincing the doctor, or if you like, the reader, that this version of events is plausible, it's foolproof, and you want to avoid leaving any gaping gaps or wounds in your story, if you like. So I typically would propose the likeliest diagnosis and how I would prioritize my management steps, hoping that I can justify my thinking process, when the consultant starts to unpick and scrutinize what I've had to say.
I love that framing. I think that's such a cool way to think about it, and it does make sense because they lend so well to each other. And I think another thing that we've touched on is in terms of that building connection and being able to communicate. I feel like such a big part of medicine, even that's why when we're assessed in our OSCEs or ISCEs or whatever you call it, how you're able to explain something complex in a simple way to a patient. And I think creative writing blends so well to that because it's being able to take this image or this idea that you have in your head and bring it out in a way that others can read and connect to it. Yeah, have you found that writing or creative writing has helped your communication in medicine?
I definitely have. I think on the point of structuring the story, so say when I'm writing creatively and I don't have to construct like a synopsis for a book, it's of course a summary. And as a doctor or as a medical student even, I'll often have to summarize a case. So for example, in handover, if I'm appealing to another person and I'm trying to get a referral through, then I would have to begin with, say, the most pressing issue or the headline is what they call it. And then I would follow that through with background, key findings, investigation findings, and then my recommendations. And in this way, I've produced a non-linear narrative that tracks trends and patterns, but it still maintains this skeletal integrity, if you like. And just another point, I think a huge thing for me is also been able to, the ability to unflash a case and not take it at face value. And creative writing's definitely helped with that, to kind of elicit the subtle cues of a patient, be it the hesitation, the Freudian slip, or the silence. And it really allows me to inform my history and examination, just to think more broadly. It's really about the unpicking of the human condition. And unfortunately, this slips between the cracks of medical education, but of course it's indispensable.
Elgan, could you share how writing has helped improve your clinical experience?
Yeah, I think the thing it's helped me do, and I suppose this is the learning process within writing. Gita, I'd really like to hear what you think about it as well, because you actually teach it, I suppose. But getting better at writing for myself has basically made me better at forming a story and forming something I'm going to say. It's like, it's another way of communicating. And particularly in journalistic style writing, you take a lot of information and you choose what the most important piece of information you want your reader to hear, and you put it at the very top. And then you form your top line of your argument, and you sort of make your writing sort of like a giant pyramid upside down with the most important things first. And I suppose that's what you're also doing when you're explaining something to a patient. You're trying to find a hook for them. You're trying to deliver them the most pertinent information. You're always trying to make it concise. You're always trying to make it compelling as well, and sort of cut the sort of 30% of extra information you didn't need to put in there. And that's what you do in writing. And that's also, I think, what makes a good explanation for a patient, or a good consultation, or a motivational interview with a patient. So I feel there's a lot more technicality in how you write and how you communicate than you first realise. I suppose it is quite a technical science, I suppose. Do you agree, Gita? I'm basically say writing is science, not humanities.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. There is a craft to writing, and there are rules that you can learn to help. As you say, this sense of being able to proceed, to synthesize, to gather information and express it in a way that, you're the advocate for a patient, particularly in the student years when so often you're conveying the patient's case to your senior doctors. But the other thing I'd say is that, writing isn't all about actually writing. One of the first things we do is an exercise where, I'm sure you both remember this, where you have to go off out into the world and try and describe a scene, but not use a visual sense at all, to make you concentrate on all five senses. And I think, as Khadijah referred to, sort of being able to pick up things like body language, the tremor in the voice, the kind of mise en scène, what the patient's home situation is like if you do a home visit. All of those are powers of observation, and you need to be able to observe to become a writer, to see what's going on. So I think all of that is strengthened by writing as well. And in terms of actually what you give to the patient, I think particularly in that situation, we sometimes don't realize how fraught and how heightened that situation is for a patient. Even if it's routine for us, to them, it may be the most significant thing that's happened to them that day, that week, even that month or year. And so being able to choose our words very precisely with a sense of sensitivity for the patient situation is so important. The weight of those few words, particularly in situations like breaking bad news, for example, is so crucial. So I think any kind of improved facility that you have with writing, whether it's creative, journalistic, nonfiction writing, the better you are with language, the more you'll be able to use that in your consultations to express things to the patient.
And I think a lot of it is looking at the patient, and what you notice, and what it's actually what the patient doesn't say, what they omit, and what you think they're holding back. And oftentimes, I've kind of learned that it's actually at the end of a consultation, the very last thing that the patient says, it's the most important thing, and it's like the final piece of the puzzle, and it takes that time for them to kind of open up to you. I guess it's a holistic kind of thing. It's not just based on one, particular, I guess, feature.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I just wanted to add very quickly that it's kind of just developing what Elgin said about the concise way of writing in medicine and how it hones that craft of technical skill. It reminded me of a book that I read by Ian McEwan. I think it's called Saturday, and he writes from the perspective of a brain surgeon working not far from here, actually, in kind of Euston area. And I remember listening to an interview with Ian McEwan, and he said that at the stage of sort of his A-levels or O-levels, perhaps it was at this time, he was torn between choosing between the sciences and the humanities because he had such skill in both, but of course he went down the humanities route. And whenever I read his writing, it always strikes me as very technical and very concise. I can just imagine him performing as a doctor. And so when he wrote from the perspective of a doctor, it really was so compelling. And I just found that very interesting. And I wonder if I'm drawn to lots of his work because he manages to convey things in such an accurate way, which I suppose is very similar to what we do in medicine.
In the honour of today's episode, Doctors Who Write, I thought it could be quite fun for all of us to kind of create a reading list together that the listeners could go away and read, I guess. I was at Waterstones recently and I saw that Adam Kay's book is like on the bestsellers list, and it reminded me that there are so many doctors or ex-doctors such as Gita who write wonderful things, and I thought it could be fun for us to discuss it. I'll start maybe with Gita then. Do you have any recommendations?
So I guess a book I've read recently, and I know that Rageshri has been on this podcast as well, is Unheard by Rageshri Dhairyawan, and it's about silencing in medicine. I really recommend that. It's wonderful. I also like to, during my medical humanities degree, because I did a master's at King's, I came across a wonderful book that I actually wrote about for my dissertation, which is called The Undying by Anne Boyer, and it's about her experience of breast cancer treatment. And I suppose the reason I like this is because I don't know how familiar you are with Arthur Frank's framing of patient narratives, the quest narrative, the restitution narrative, the chaos narrative. And I feel that because her work is kind of poetic and fragmented, it's a slightly different way of looking at medical narratives. Sometimes we feel that medical narratives have to have a kind of shape where we end up with a happy ending or everything was beautifully resolved and tied up in the end. And The Undying is very much not about that. So I think I recommend those two, Unheard by Rageshri Dhairyawan and The Undying by Anne Boyer. Can I give you one more? Yeah. This is an essay and it's very short and it's available free online. So I might even get Zaynah to add this in the links at the end. But it's an essay by Leslie Jamison called The Empathy Exams, which is about her experience of being a patient actor, in a NOSD in America. And it's a very eye-opening essay is what I'll say, but it's great. So The Empathy Exams by Leslie Jamison is my last one.
Yeah. I have a few recommendations as well. Firstly, I was going to start with When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. In terms of my plan before about doing like literature and biology as a dual major, was actually inspired by him because that's what he did at Stanford. Yeah, and I found it like so incredible. And then he went on to become a brilliant neurosurgeon. But I thought it was pretty cool to have that kind of path. And the book is really... yeah, it's heartbreaking. I was like, how do I frame this? But it's beautifully written and it's really powerful. I would recommend. And then a few different things. So I was also looking at things written by patients. So my dissertation, I actually did it on poetry written by patients in Victorian asylums. An example of that would be like by John Clare, who was quite a famous like romantic poet, but his experiences, a lot of them were written in asylum. And I think that's something that Gita touched on earlier about narrative medicine, which is something that I really love. And even in the modern day, like thinking about hearing a patient's perspective and how writing can give them a different space to kind of express their feelings in a way that maybe a 15-minute consultation can't cover. So I would recommend reading patient writing. And also one that I love is, I love Ocean Vuong generally. I'd always talk about Ocean Vuong, but he has a poetry collection called Time as a Mother, which was about his experience of losing his mum to breast cancer. But there are some really powerful poems in there that kind of touch on the carer experience as well, and that kind of perspective of when someone in a healthcare space can't advocate for themselves because they don't speak the language. How does the carer help bridge that gap, and what role do they play in the impact it has on them? So those would be my few recommendations. Khadijah, do you have any more?
Yeah, interesting. I have to admit that the further I plunge into medicine, the less I gravitate towards memoirs penned by sort of people like us, so medical students, doctors, nurses. What I find more interesting is to unravel the perceptions or lived experiences of patients themselves, whose experience of illness is a far cry from, say, the medical reductiveness of disease. So a firm favourite for me would be Hilary Mantel's book, Giving Up the Ghost. And she famously, had similar feelings that she wanted to, quote unquote, seize the copyright. And really, that book details her life of being pawned off on other doctors who really struggled to pinpoint a certain diagnosis. So, at times she was labelled a neurotic, a malingerer, or she became a hysterectomy patient. And in the book, she subverts the idea that accuracy and objective truth is all that matters. And instead, her emotional truth of, say, hallucinations, ghosts, and delusions are given equal weight because they're, I suppose, more remarkable to her.
Mm-hmm. Elgan, do you have any more to add?
Yeah, I might go back to the medical writers and maybe even go outside of fiction or novels. I think somebody that's really interesting to read, and you can read easily online, is I suppose he's not a journalist, but he's more of a commentator, someone called Phil Whitaker. He's a GP. I think he now works in Canada. But he writes some amazing, if you like, long-form journalism that summarises what I think is a really difficult topic often to summarise, which is sort of the area of medical politics and sort of health in government. And there's lots of sort of big debates about the future of healthcare and where money's going and things like that. And he summarises it into what I think are quite compelling pieces of writing that just do a beautiful job of it. You can read it and be quite wowed. So definitely his writing. And the other person is Rachel Clarke. She's a palliative care doctor. She's got a big following on social media. She's written a few books that are really, really good. And the most recent one is one called Story of a Heart. That's, I've read about the first half. I haven't finished it yet, but that's really, really good. It's about basically the story of transplanting a heart into a child, and the whole story of the NHS's ability to do that, basically all the people involved, and the journey that happens.
I'm really excited to actually go away and read all of these because there's so much that I haven't. So thank you. Maira, did you have any more to add?
Yeah, I had a couple. I think one is by Dr. Amanda Brown, and she wrote The Prison Doctor, and it was a really sort of stark insight into doing this job that it's a really difficult, rigorous job. And obviously she's working with some of the most kind of vilified people in society, and people who I guess typically, in the news and the media don't get a lot of sympathy. And she was kind of showing the difficulties and the raw kind of vulnerabilities and struggles. And from her perspective, they're her patients before they are any of these characters. And I think that was a really unique, refreshing perspective to see. And I think the other book that I've really enjoyed is The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And that's from the perspective of patient, and he had this kind of like dream job, as editor-in-chief of Elle magazine, and then suffered a stroke, and he had like locked-in syndrome, and he could only communicate via his eyes, blinking, and he kind of wrote this memoir from his perspective, and it was really kind of a difficult read, but it kind of it's that other side that you'll never really get to hear. It was very eye-opening.
Definitely. And the last one that you mentioned, Diving Bell Butterfly, I guess for the listeners, I've forgotten the author's name, but because he was only able to blink, he worked with someone else, and they used like a phonetic alphabet and like blinked the letters out. So it's fairly short, but even how much is written, it's so powerful to think that those were all through blinks. So I would echo that. But these are all very wonderful recommendations, and I look forward to hearing from the listeners how you find these, and also leave any comments or replies or anything about any recommendations that you have for us as well. Thank you to everyone for sharing your advice, the reading list that we've created together with the recommendations, and also for coming here today. I'm really honoured that this is my first episode, and I've really enjoyed this conversation with you all, so I would like to thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Zaynah. It's been so much fun.
That's all we have time for today, unfortunately. I'd like to thank our panelists and, of course, Gita, our guest, for coming on today and having such a wonderful conversation with us. Thank you to the listeners for listening to this episode of Sharp Scratch. If you like this episode, make sure that you subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to them, and support us by leaving a review. Share it with the people you know, and be back here in 2 weeks' time for our next episode. Please keep in touch. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and follow us on all our social media. We are BMJ Student on all the socials and Sharp Scratch Podcast on TikTok. And thank you. I've been your host, Zaynah. Until then, stay sharp, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.